Claudine Hemingway is a descendant of famed writer Ernest Hemingway. We bumped into each other at a party and decided to team up and dive deep into French history, but with a twist, by bringing a spotlight to those lesser known creatives in France. This is History with a Hemingway.
Welcome back to the show, guys. Today we are talking about Ernest Hemingway, and we're talking about the books written about him and also the books written by him. So you might learn some new books today that you might want to check out. So many people are fans of Ernest Hemingway, and Claudine has all the information for us.
Yeah, and there's a lot, and I get a lot of times people will ask me, or I get a lot of people saying, "Oh, I had to read them in high school. I didn't really like it." And I say, you know what? Go back and read it again now that you're older. And, nobody likes anything they're told to read. You never get to
Yeah.
like the greatest book in the world if somebody says, sit down, you have to finish this.
So true. I reread so many books from high school, and I was like, I have a totally different idea about what these books mean now.
Yeah, and I think especially some of his books, like some of his stories about Nick Adams, I think you have to be older to really understand what it's even trying to tell you. Because I think
Yeah.
some of the content maybe it's not so great for, a 16-year-old or 15-year-old. So I'm going to share some of the ones and also the specific versions you need to actually read, because that makes a big difference too. So even if you're not the huge Hemingway disciple, if you love Paris, one of the books you have to, of course, read, which is the book I think most people read when they're coming to Paris, is A Movable Feast. The book was published after he died. It was published in 1964 under the guidance of his fourth wife, that I do not like, Mary Hemingway. And the reason I don't like her is mostly because of this book, but I'll tell you why. And Harry Bragg, who was at Scribner's publishing house. In 1956, a manager at the Ritz Hotel contacted Ernest and had told him that there was a trunk in the basement that was of his stuff. Some say the trunk was made, some people will tell you the story that the trunk was done by Louis Vuitton himself. He crafted it and gave it to him. Louis Vuitton had died quite a long time before that, so that doesn't really add up, but it goes to the romantic story. But who knows if that part of it's true. But it was said that it was left by him in March of 1928, which also really doesn't really add up because he didn't have the money at that time to really afford to go to the Ritz. So who knows? Sometimes it's just part of the legend. But he called these his Paris sketches. And when he would write, he would never write about the place he was. So when he was living in Paris, he was writing about Michigan and Chicago. And then when he went back and he was living in Idaho, that's when he picked up and worked on what he called the Paris sketches again. It was his tales of his early days in Paris with Hadley, his first wife. And then, of course, it goes into a little bit about Pauline, but also the stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald. In this book, he's painted at times as being quite the bully and a jerk, and even some of the stuff that he wrote about his wife. But a lot of that was edited, and I'll tell you why. But in the last few months of his life, he started working on the final chapters of this book. And it was when he was locked away in the Mayo Clinic, when he was getting electric shock therapy, which is a story not a lot of people know. But he was sent twice to the Mayo Clinic because he just, they thought he was going, he had all those concussions from car accidents and plane crashes. And people thought he was paranoid. He thought J. Edgar Hoover had files on him and he was being watched. And they said, no, you're crazy. But years later, we found out, no, J. Edgar Hoover was watching him. So some of these things, but he was, after all these concussions, really having a hard time. So he would one time try to kill himself. They sent him to the Mayo Clinic for electric shock therapy. He convinced him he was okay. Then he later tried to kill himself again. They sent him as well. Then, as we know, he came back the second time. And then a couple of days later, he did actually kill himself. But the pages for the Paris sketches were still in his typewriter the day that he died. After his death, Mary, I'm saying that with a tone, went through his papers. He was a huge pack rat. And so that's something we're very happy about. But she contacted a friend of his named A.E. Hotchner. in regards to these Paris sketches. Hotchner went to visit him that last time at the Mayo Clinic, and Hemingway told him, I'm redoing and I'm working on the last chapter of this because I want to write this story, and it's about Hadley. And so if you read the last chapter, if you have this book at home and you're listening to this, go get it, pull it out, read that last chapter. And when you read that, knowing that he says about Paris and how much he loved it, but he's really actually saying that about Hadley, it will make you cry. It made me cry the first time when I read that years ago, knowing that's what he did. It just made me cry because it's just so sad. But Mary and Harry Brock at Scribner's started to kind of butcher what he wrote. They changed a lot of it, making him look a lot worse, especially with the relationship with Fitzgerald. He looked like, a lot of people have said to me, oh, he was so mean to Fitzgerald, but that's because that's how Hadley and the editor, Mary, had edited it to make it look that way. And she didn't like where he said some of the nice things about his first two wives, and she had that changed as well.
Yeah, you really need to read the original version to get the real story.
Yeah, and the greatest thing is, it's in 2011 they did this one called, it says, specifically has a big stamp on there. It says the restored edition. You could find this one. You could go to my website. I will put all of these are linked on my website, and you need to make sure you get the one with the same cover, because this one has all of those stories in it, and it has his different versions in it, and some of them, the chapters have like 2 or 3 different versions that he wrote, and it's so amazing to see that, and you will just be seething with anger when you read some of it because of Mary.
Mary,
Everybody hates Pauline, but nope, Mary was the worst one. So, but another great book that he did in 1925, this was his first big blockbuster that he wrote. After he went to the festival of San Fermin and Pamplona, he went there for 3 years in a row. He decided to write about it, and that's where he wrote about bullfighting and his friends in Paris, which Gertrude Stein ended up calling the Lost Generation, which she actually just heard from a guy at the car mechanic. She didn't come up with that term, but post-war Americans were aimlessly going through life without any direction and drinking away because it was prohibition back in the States. Hemingway actually took offense to being called that, and he didn't really like it that she said that. But, go back to the episode we did about Gertrude Stein. She's full of contradictions and wasn't exactly the greatest person. In fact, the second title for this book, she had thought he had told her that she told him that he should call it The Lost Generation, but he decided to call it The Sun Also Rises. And that is it's a phrase that he got from the Bible in the Old Testament.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so he and his friend John Dos Passos was sitting at the Closerie des Lilas, that's right there at the end of the Luxembourg Garden, and they were looking through the Old Testament, and it's a quote. There's a passage that says, one generation paths away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abides forever. The sun also ariseth.
I like that. That's a great title.
Yeah, so that's where he got a couple book titles from the Bible, which is interesting. The first draft was finished in September of 1925, just as the steps of his marriage with Hadley were marching to their finish. It was published on October 22nd, 1926. After they separated, the book was dedicated to Hadley and Jack. And then in the divorce papers, he gave her all the rights to the book and all future royalties. 6 months after the printing, she was given a check for the first 18,363 copies, which was $5,577. Do you know how much that would have been worth 100 years ago?
$1 billion.
Well, I mean, not that much, but it would be close to $100,000 today.
That's
she
amazing.
got in 6 months.
That's amazing.
And it went on to be one of the most translated books in history and has never, ever been out of print.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, there's only a few other books you could say that about, and one of them is the Bible.
Well, no wonder he was inspired by the Bible.
He was pretty smart marketing on his plan. But you could find in 2015 the Hemingway Library edition that's of that. It's specific one. And again, look on my website at the pictures. You could click on the links and buy them through Amazon. I get like a cent from each one. But it has all the early drafts in it, as well as deleted pages that he has in this one, and it's amazing. It's so cool to read.
Don't think I've actually read that one yet. I've read a lot of his books, but I'm going to pick it up.
And it starts in Paris. So, and he mentions the Closerie de Lila, and he's mentioned sitting there in the shadow of the statue of Marshal Ney. So it's pretty cool. I mean, especially the ones, that mention Paris. It's pretty cool because you could just go walk in those places. Another one that he did that he got the idea in Paris was at 2 a.m. on March 4th, 1928, after a night out drinking with his friend Archibald McLeish. He came home to his apartment that he had with Pauline, the second wife, on Rue Férou, which is just up the street from Saint-Sulpice. He had divorced Hadley again in April 1927, and that May, as soon as it was the divorce, like 2 weeks after the divorce was final, he and Pauline got married. They ended up staying there, and it was on the top floor of the Hôtel de Lousy, and where you could walk by it. I take people by it all the time on my Hemingway tours and tell them the story. But it has the 2 sphinxes over the entrance. But he came home and really late at night, and he reached up and he went to the restroom, and he thought he was pulling the chain to flush the toilet, but he pulled the chain that opened the skylight, and it came flying down onto his head and cut this massive gash into his forehead. He wrapped 32 layers of toilet paper on it, and then they took him to the American hospital in Neuilly. And when he was there, that's when he got the idea to write his book, A Farewell to Arms.
So you just need a good hit to the head, and then you have a great novel.
Yeah. And that year on August 20th, he finished his first draft. He wrote it very quickly. It is set in World War I during the Italian campaign. Tells the story of this young American lieutenant, Frederick Henry, who was in the ambulance corps and falls in love with a nurse. Her last name was Barkley. It's loosely based on him following. He drove an ambulance in the First World War in Italy. And then he was taken to the hospital in Milan and fell in love with Agnes, who was a woman that broke his heart and probably ruined him for every woman after that. Because after that, he would never let a woman leave him again.
I wonder what happened to her.
She moved on and she sent him a Dear John letter back in Chicago and was like, sorry. And then after that, he never let them leave him.
Yeah, but it's interesting because she must have found out one day, like, oh, she turned down like this famous writer man.
Yeah. But, I've always said that if he, there's so many people because they read that book, The Paris Wife, which is not on my list because it's historical fiction. But everybody always says like, oh, I hate Pauline. Hadley was so sweet. But he never would have become the person we know him as if it wasn't for Pauline and all of her family's money, because they started going on safaris and, down in Key West and all of these things. And so that's, everything happens for a reason. Who knows maybe he would have become something else.
Exactly.
Never know. But they also did a restored version of this one in 2012. He had 39 different endings for the book. And this book has every single one of them.
Every one of them? Whoa.
Yeah. Which is pretty cool. I mean, they're not like, it's not like the book is a doorstop like Ulysses, but it is pretty cool to get to read all of them. Another one, and some of the ones that are about him, I also already mentioned the gentleman A.E. Hotchner. He was a very close friend of Hemingway. He ended up actually writing. He was a writer for Cosmopolitan, which was a very different magazine than what we think of Cosmo.
Yeah.
But this was like a serious magazine. And he also met Hemingway, and then he became the one that would help turn a lot of his books into screenwriting. So Gary Cooper played him in a movie. And so Hotchner would be the one that would work with Hemingway to adapt it for the screen. And so towards the end, when his memory was starting to go and he was having a hard time writing, he wrote this article, and they said, you need to narrow this down. This article needs to be like 7,000 words, not 50,000 words. You have to do. And he was like, I can't do it. I cannot do it. So he contacted Hotchner and said, I need you to come down here and help me. And he did. And so during that time, Hotchner started talking to him and recording all these conversations. So they had this very close friendship. And so he was with him at the end when he was at the Mayo Clinic and talked to him. And then he wrote this book after he died. He wrote a book in 1966, 5 years after Hemingway's death, called Papa Hemingway. And it's documenting their adventures in Cuba to Europe, major moments. Hemingway talks about all these moments in the past. I think if you're going to read one book about Hemingway that was written by somebody else, as far as biographies, this is the one, because all of these things came straight from the source and they were recorded conversations he had with Hemingway.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I want to read that.
It's really good. And there's another one that I love that I got a few years ago. It's called Hemingway in Love, His Own Story. Hotchner waited until 2015 to write this, long after the death of Mary, the fourth wife. And so he wanted to wait to write about all of these, his 4 women in his life, until after she died, so he could write whatever he wanted. But it's a small book. You could actually find it here in Paris at Shakespeare and Company. But it's a really, really great book. I absolutely love that book. And that's where you will read the story, what he says about rewriting that last chapter of Movable Feast. It's a really great one. Again, you can find all these on my website. Michael Reynolds wrote 5 volumes of the life of Hemingway, broken up by, there's the young Hemingway when he was a child. Then there was the Paris years. Then there was Hemingway, the Homecoming, in the 1920s. And then also Hemingway in the 30s, and then the final years. And these are actually really, really fantastic books as well about the life of Hemingway. Those are really great. And so those are ones you could also find online. And if the Paris years, of course, is the one I think the most people know about, but you should also check out all the other ones. And then you could also read about Martha Gellhorn, who was the 3rd wife, who was our favorite.
I love Martha. She's such a fascinating lady.
She was such a kick-ass woman. She was amazing. And we did a whole episode about her. So I'll put all of those. We did one about Hadley. We will not be doing one about Mary. I have nothing good to say, as you can tell. Another amazing one, and you could, over the next, 60 years, we could be collecting these. It is all part of the Cambridge collection. Has started, and they started this quite a few years ago, and it is the Cambridge collection of letters. And so this is another thing that Mary did that he did not want. He was a pack rat, as I said. He saved everything. When he would write letters to people, he made carbon copies of it and saved the letter. And he never wanted this. He said, I don't want any of my letters published. I don't want anything to happen to these. But she did. She ended up sending a lot of this stuff you could find at the JFK Library in Boston. But a lot of these letters, and it's kind of great that we actually have it, even though it was against his wishes, because with these letters, a lot of those stories that everybody knows, like Hadley losing all of his manuscripts. And, he even writes in Movable Feast that he turned around and instantly got on the train and came back to Paris. But we know from his letters, he didn't do that. He didn't come back to Paris for almost two months. So you get to actually go through, and Cambridge did all of this research on each of the letters. The person he wrote it to saying, this is who this was. This is who he was in the life. This letter was sent to his mother where she would stay on Nantucket in the summers. Fascinating. They're absolutely fascinating. There's 5 editions out right now. From 1907 to 1934 is what we're up to. And they said they're going to ultimately have 17 volumes.
Wow, that's incredible.
And each one of them is like 4 inches thick. So these, I shipped these to Paris. When I moved, these were ones I shipped to myself.
Wow.
And they really are fascinating if you really want to get into it. And that's where you really could find out some of the stories, where, what was the stories that he wrote. Some people really believe every single thing he wrote. It took it as gospel. There's stories in Movable Feast that he talks about saying, like when he said he was having problems in the bedroom right after he and Pauline got married. And she said, go down to Saint-Sulpice in the church and pray. He was not Catholic. He didn't believe in any of that. But he writes in the book that he goes down to Saint-Sulpice and he sits in the chapel and he, prays to a saint, and then he goes home and he's triumphant in the bedroom again. That story happened, but it actually happened in Florida.
In Florida.
But he writes that it happened here because he was a writer, and that's what you get to do, especially when he's writing his own stories of these tales of his life, but not as a biography. So there's people that are like, but that's what he said. And so these books of letters are a great way to really see like, oh no, but this is the true part of it. And this is that actual timeline.
Yeah, those sound great.
They're really, really cool. I definitely recommend picking up. I'm sure you could find some of those at your local library. But if you really want to get the details, those are the ones. But the two Hotchner books, I think are two of my very favorites. Because so much has been written, the Paris Wife. Everybody thinks they know the story of Hadley and Pauline because of the Paris Wife. But again, that's historical fiction. It's not actually the actual story. And the writer, while it is a great book, she made up conversations, she made up stories, even, a lot of people don't believe there was this three-way that happened between Mary, Pauline, and Ernest. And so, you can't take historical fiction as actual truth. It is historical fiction.
Very true. I still love The Paris Wife.
Yeah. But there's other books. Read that one and then read the one that she actually had her friend write about their life. If you want to read Paris Wife, then read that one afterwards.
Read them all, guys.
Read all of them. Yes. And then we'll do a book report on it to send to me.
Book reports. I miss book reports. Not
I
really.
know. That's why people don't like to didn't like reading these books because they had to do it.
Yeah, but now they're going to revisit them and be re-inspired.
And you like it. I was at my one time years ago at my favorite place and Le Bon Comptoir, and I walked in there and I was talking to my friend Jordan who was working, and this guy was sitting there and he looked over and he goes, "Did you see what that guy was reading?" And I go, "No." And I looked over and the guy was reading, had Movable Feast sitting there. And I looked over and I go, "Oh, hey," I go, "That's a great book." He goes, "I know, so cliche, right? I mean, could you read anything more cliche while you're in Paris?" And I go, "No, it's a great book." And then my friend Jordan was like, "Why didn't you tell him? You should have told him." But I was like, "No, I'm not going to tell him." But I see people with that all the time. They have Movable Feast and they bring it to Paris or they buy it here and they're reading it. And it's so great because you could just basically go back into that time. Go sit go sit near the fountain of Saint Michel and read the book, read the passage where he talks about sitting right there.
Yeah, I think it's almost like a guidebook in some ways. I know my first year, my first week, my friend bought it for me as a gift. I didn't even know what it was. And yeah, it's a great book for when you arrive.
It is. And sometimes like I even have it, I downloaded the Audible version of it. And it is it's read by this American author that has this amazing voice, and especially those first couple chapters of it are my favorite. And I just one day I just put it on like an early Sunday morning, and I just was walking through like, and I walked through Place Saint Michel and stuff, and I was just listening to it, and it was magical.
Well, guys, now you have some good ideas for your next book purchases, and you can find all this on ClaudineHemingway.com. Look at the list, click on her links, and definitely tune in next week. And we can't wait to catch up with you guys.
Thanks for listening today, guys. If you're interested in learning more about Claudine, her tours, history, and the beautiful photographs that she posts all over Instagram, tune into her website, ClaudineHemingway.com.